Good morning, everybody. It's Monday morning, and welcome to the Vicarage here at Penn. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. I know I certainly did, and good to see you. And thank you for joining us, as always, for our Bible talk for today. Remind you, as always, don't forget to push the share button at the bottom. We've had an increase in views recently because people have been sharing. So do please share it with your friends so other people can enjoy the Bible talks too. Friends, we are, as you know, working our way through the amazing book of Psalms, which is essentially the Old Testament hymn book. And it's absolutely brilliant. And we're on Psalm 4 this morning. Now, like I always say with Bible reading, I'm going to give you another hint later on as well. With Bible reading, always try and understand the context. Always try and understand what happened before, around who's saying it, who's saying it's to, because that means you understand it much better. And the context of this morning's reading is, it says here, there's a title, it was a Psalm of David. So this has clearly been written by King David. You also know, you can ascertain clearly that he's in some kind of trouble. We don't know what the trouble is. Psalm 3, of course, had him at the time when his son Absalom tried to do essentially a coup and unseat him. That was the trouble in Psalm 3. And it may be that's the same trouble in Psalm 4. We don't know. But one way or another, you can ascertain that David and the people around him are in some degree of trouble. The other thing he says here, he says to the leader, which I think essentially means sort of the choir master, something like that. He says, with stringed instruments. I think it's quite ironic because when we think of psalms, we tend to think of them sung by some robed choir, and it's wonderful, isn't it? With some glorious pipe organ, sung to wonderful, glorious Anglican metrical chant. Whereas actually here it's quite clear that it was originally written for a stringed instrument. So that's ironic, isn't it? And the other thing, a question which people often ask me is, a couple of times in this psalm, you see the word in italics, Selah, down the right hand side. You see it after verse 2 and you see it after verse 4. What does Selah mean? Well, as I understand it, it's a kind of musical term, because this was written to the choir master. And it could mean a kind of a musical pause, like a pause in the music, or it could be a kind of change of instrument. If this was played on an organ, it would mean a change of stops, or if it means, if we're playing on string instruments, perhaps you might move from the violins to the cellos, or from the lute to the harp, or something. So it means, it's a kind of musical term. It means either a musical pause, or it could be a kind of change of instrument. Either way, Selah is a kind of musical thing, and it reminds us that the Psalms were originally written they were written like hymns and songs. So there we go. So, Psalm 4, I'm not going to sing it to you, I'll read it to you. Here goes, Psalm 4. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You give me room when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. How long, you people, shall you my honour suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. When you are disturbed, do not sin. Ponder it on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, oh, that we might see some good. Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and wine abound. I will both lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, we have King David here speaking. King David in some degree of trouble. And from the very beginning, in verses 1 and 2, David places himself on God's side. He says, he calls himself, O God of my right. So David, there's the trouble going on, but from the get-go, if you like, David places himself entirely on God's side. Then he goes on to say, and he talks to God, he reminds himself in God's presence, he reminds God and reminds himself while talking to God, that God's helped him in the past. He says here, you gave me room when I was in distress. So, David's placing himself entirely on God's side. Secondly, he's reminding himself in conversation with God that God has helped him in the past, and that's really important too. Thirdly, he goes on to talk then about the trouble he's in now, and he's asking God, you've helped me in the past, please can you be gracious to me now? So, just to remind you what's going on here. David's got this trouble, and he places himself entirely on God's hands. And he says to God, you've helped me in the past. He then goes on to say, be gracious to me, hear my prayer, and help me now. So again, that's really important for prayer. He's placing himself on God. He reminds himself and reminds God how God's helped him in the past. And now he's saying, now I'm in trouble now. Would you help me now? That's really important. Then he looks around him and he said, and bear in mind the context is that there's some kind of trouble going on here. He looks around and he sees other people turning to different things, and believing all sorts of lies and vain things and whatever else. And he says, how long, O people, shall my honour suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? So he says, I'm on God's side. God's help, I'm on God's side. Why do you look to other things? Okay, why do you want to do that? And he goes on to say, look, God's helped me. Why on earth would you want to look for other things? So he's placing himself on God's side, okay? He's reminding himself with God how God's helped him in the past, and he's asking God to help him now. And he's looking around at the people around him who are clearly kind of worried and mithered about things and looking to all sorts of things. And he says, look, I turn to God. God has been faithful to me. It can be the same for you too. Why do you want to look to other things as well? And I think in some ways, I want to say that about the world. We have a great God. And sometimes I don't understand why other people don't want to look to the same great God that we've got. And essentially, that's what he's saying. He's saying, look, he looks around him and he says, look, why do you look to other things, folks, when you've got a greatly faithful God that you can turn to? I do. Works for me. It can work for you too. Then he goes on to talk about what to do when you're in distress. He says, when you are disturbed, do not sin. Ponder on your beds, he says, and be silent. I think sometimes when we're under pressure, they all say, don't make big decisions when you're having a bad, when times are bad, and usually it's right. And what he's saying here is, when you are disturbed, when you get rattled by something, when something's going on, be careful what you do. It's tempting, isn't it, when we're under pressure to lash out or just say something stupid or do something inappropriate or whatever, just which is inappropriate to the situation, and to lash out or say something or whatever, these people have got this gift to be able to make the nasty cutting remark. I've never had that gift, and actually I'm glad I haven't, because you don't want to do it. And what he's saying here is, when you are disturbed, do not sin. You'll be tempted sometimes to so to speak, lash out and say that horrible comment or whatever. But he's saying, don't do it. Instead, he says, offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. Tempted though you may be to lash out, tempted though you may be to do something angry or horrible, he says, just don't. Put your trust in God instead. And that's what he's kind of advising the people to do here. But then he talks about the way to peace. This is the point when I want to give you another hint for reading the Bible. If ever you're reading the Bible and you think to yourself, I'm sure I've read that before somewhere, then stay with that. Because actually it may be in verse 6, when you heard the words, the light of your face, or the light of your countenance shine upon you, O Lord. It reminds, it's meant, and especially in verse 1, he talks about being, verse 1, it's about be gracious to me. Perhaps it makes us think of the blessing from Aaron. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his light of his countenance upon you and give you peace. And essentially, that's what he's saying will happen if we do that. Okay. And he ends then by saying, we'll both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety. So he's saying, you may be tempted to lash out or whatever, but don't. Make right sacrifices, put your trust in God, and that peace that Aaron talked about, the Lord will lift up the light of his countenance and will give you peace. And that is the route to peace in God. So, you've got David here in trouble, okay? And he comes before God and he places himself he's saying, on God's side. Then he goes on to say, Lord, you've helped me in the past. You've been gracious to me in the past. Please can you be gracious to me now? He says to other people, look, he looks around and he says, look, God's been good to me. God can be good to you. Don't trust in lies. Trust in God instead. And what's more, particularly when you're under stress, when you're feeling disturbed, he says, especially in those times when you really want to lash out and do something stupid, don't trust in God instead. And that way you will receive the Aaronic blessing. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. But I always like to finish these talks with Jesus, because it reminds me also in a New Testament version, which is Philippians 4:4-7, which says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in all things, with prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Friends, put yourself fair and square with God. Be constantly reminding yourself of God's goodness. Okay? Don't be tempted to lash out, but in all things, especially when you're under pressure, turn to God, make right sacrifices, and trust in God. And the peace of God, which was for Aaron, was with David, was with Paul, will be with us now. God bless you. Have a lovely